Welcome back to MyFinJourney. Today's guest is Faisal Ensaun, a high-performance coach who has coached more than 2,000 individuals across a wide range of environments, from students and stay-at-home parents to entrepreneurs, executives, CEOs, and athletes. Since becoming certified in high-performance coaching in 2015, Faisal has spent years helping people reconnect with their vision, clarity, and personal potential, especially during periods where life or business begin to feel stuck or misaligned. He's also the co-founder of Coaching Mastery Community, where he helps train other coaches to deepen their coaching skills and build sustainable practices. And through the Space Creators community, he runs weekly coaching sessions focused on helping people create the internal space required for growth and transformation. For the MyFinJourney audience, people building businesses, wealth, and responsibility, this is the conversation that you want to hear. Something where we dive deeper into how you can maintain clarity, energy, and alignment while operating at a high level. Faisal, welcome to MyFinJourney.
Super excited to be here. Thank you for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure. Faisal, I want to understand and I want to dive right in by hearing from you how you got to where you are. What enabled you to be in a position where you can help over 2,000 people?
Yeah, the number is probably a lot higher. That my upside is out of date, but I've been on this journey for almost 11 years now, over a decade. I feel like it goes back to my story, and I like sharing that because I feel like people need to see the struggle before they see progress. It's a human thing, and if you don't see the struggle, you probably don't believe the progress either, because we all go through that journey. It's just common. And for me, that journey started in my early 20s, where I struggled with all kinds of addictions, from alcohol to drugs and all kinds of stuff. And basically I was addicted to any medium that was addictive. And at the time, I didn't even realize that was the case. It was just I operated like a functional alcoholic, I would say. And years later, when I started sharing my story, even my family was surprised by that. But at the time, I was struggling. I was struggling until this low point where I still remember I was coming out of a subway station, and it was a weekday, and I'm coming out, and it's out of multiple nights of partying or having fun. And I go to the corner of the subway station in Toronto region, and I throw up. I see blood. I'm not really surprised by that, because I knew I had been abusing my body for the past few years. And in that moment, I just felt it all, the sense of disappointment in myself, lack of faith, lack of connection, disconnection from my family, from my friends, from myself more than anything else. And for the first time, I didn't just feel it in my biology, I felt it all over. And that was the time where I wasn't even I was sort of considering, is this life worth it? And that could lead to all kinds of things with everything. But in retrospect, as I look back, I feel like it was God's grace that I kind of pulled myself out, because there are lots of people in that situation that didn't pull themselves out. And I remember after that moment, after I watched kind of everybody pass me by, and I felt like my whole life was passing me by, and it's like, what went wrong? I came from a good family. My parents did their best to get us to this side of the world. And I was doing well up until a few years ago, and all of a sudden I went towards this darkness. And I didn't know the answers, and that's what actually pushed me towards the questions. And I started asking the right questions. I re-enrolled myself back to college. Actually got a job on the weekend, so I couldn't go out at all. Forced myself, because I didn't have the willpower at the time. And I started studying anything I could get my hands on, from psychology to philosophy, spirituality, history, sciences related to human behavior and natural systems, anything that would give me the answers. And the more I asked, actually, I got more questions to ask. So I realized that I needed to ask better questions, but also I needed to grow a lot in the process. And I spent the next decade going through this process while I was in college, university. And fast forward about a decade or so out after that, and I met my mentor and coach. I spent about 6 months with him, and those 6 months were probably felt just as tough in a different way, but it kind of unearthed a completely different part of me, and I felt like I had grown in those 6 months more than a decade. And I asked myself, I'm like, had I had access to this, I wouldn't have had to go through a decade of growing to even get to this point. Now, I don't regret my own journey, but I realize a lot of the pain that I went through, others don't have to go through, for one thing. And two, I realized that when I started to connect the dots, that there's a reason why I went through that process. There's a reason why I struggled. the reason why I'm still here. What am I meant to be doing with this, with that pain? Well, one way you can look at it is, well, everybody goes through pain, but I chose to look at it in a different way, that God put me through that process. And of course, I had my part in it for me to see something. And what I saw was that there was, through that pain, I saw a lot of joy, a lot of connection. I saw the value in gratitude. I saw the value in faith. I saw the value in being connected to yourself and those around me. And so I started working on that myself. And then about 11 years ago, I jumped ship and I'm like, you know what? My path is not going to be the corporate path. I need to find what that is. And I didn't know what that was. I just knew that I needed to work with people. But as I went towards this, one thing led to another, as it happens on this path. And there were different guides came in front of me. And finally, I realized that, oh, you know what? Coaching is one of the avenues, because I was also considering going back to university. But I realized that I wanted to create my own thing, and coaching is one of the avenues to work with people. So I jumped in and I realized I had a lot of the skill sets that I worked on myself became useful in the coaching process. And then I got the training, and then fast forward years later, I started, as this process started working, then I got introduced to all kinds of people. And it still feels surreal, because a lot of times in my mind, I just feel like I was struggling just a few years ago. But time passes by really fast. And when I look back, those struggles taught me a lot about working with people. And it's just, most of my clients, even 90% plus right now, is referral based. They just connect me with an organization or a person. And I primarily work with real estate investors on the niche that I market to, but I work with all kinds of people, from organizations to communities to families, and I've built a team around me of other coaches and therapists too that help them as well. My aim is really, how can I help create better leaders in families and communities and organizations, because ultimately that's what creates the influence out in the world. And I would say my journey had a lesson for me, and the lesson was, how do I contribute with this? And I happen to create a business around that, which I think is smart.
I love that, Faisal. It's so powerful, but it's also very raw, if you don't mind me saying, in the sense that when you're going through your journey, it felt like that change happened when you saw blood. Would you say that that's accurate, or not really?
Well, at the time, I always tell people, it's like, what were you thinking? I don't think I was thinking anything. I was feeling a lot of pain, but I didn't know how to make sense of it, and that's why I went on that journey to make sense of it. In retrospect, in hindsight, when I look at that moment, yes, that was the moment of shift that happened, and something internally changed for me to start being curious about the causes behind my actions. And the more I went towards that, the more I realized that, you know what, I need to grow in a lottery. I need to take responsibility. I need to start working through it. And then, just for background, in retrospect, I also realized I came from a war-torn country with my family always being in survival. I was born in Afghanistan. I didn't see it. I was very young to leave, but my parents did. They lived in the neighboring country illegally for years, and they had to make do somehow. And when you're in an environment like that, you learn to work with survival. And interestingly, when we first came to Canada, it was exciting to be here. After the excitement wore off, what came back was all the trauma that everybody had experienced. And pretty much every person from that background experiences. It's just that for me, I couldn't make sense of it. It was way too overwhelming for my mind. And I realized I had to spend a decade, whether that's my weakness or strength, I don't know. But that actually at least helped me to serve people now where I am. When I was going through it, it wasn't as simple a process.
No, I think there's a lot to unpack there, Faisal. And before we dive in terms of like the trauma and kind of understanding yourself and having that clarity to know what to work on, I wanted to also circle back to something that you mentioned about being like a functioning alcoholic. Maybe you and also like the fact that you're addicted to everything. Maybe you can kind of unpack these two things for us, for somebody who's maybe struggling and doesn't realize they're struggling. Help us understand maybe how you identified that you were addicted to something, or maybe several things, and also how other people didn't pick up on it. It wasn't a situation where somebody kind of held you by the shoulders and shook you and said, hey, Faisal, you need to kind of change direction. That realization and change had to kind of come from within.
Yeah, yeah. That's such a powerful question. If I were to look back, what I would say is, at the time, I didn't know what was going on, and it was. I remember this moment with my. So I took an elective class in psychology. I ended up taking three classes when I was studying engineering. And I still remember my psychology professor was my favorite professor. He was a fun guy, very happy, and he never would tell me what to do, where to go, but he did ask me some really good questions. I was probably the top student in his class. Interestingly, years later, I sent him an email back. I'm in your field, but thank you for at least asking those questions. So I remember when I used to go to him, he'd look at me, he's like, "What field are you in?" Engineering. He's like, "Oh, interesting." And he wouldn't, and that would just make me curious, like, "Huh, interesting." So I remember in that class, he asked this question. The question is like, well, why do people drink alcohol? And in my head, my delusion was, oh, to have fun, to socialize, to all that stuff. And we all have that delusion because it's a cultural delusion. But and then at the end of it, he and everybody had a similar set of answers. And he's like, well, people drink because they want to change their reality. I'm like, first of all, it was denial. I was like, what is he talking about? Because I had to face my own thing. And then over the next few months, I thought about it quite a bit. I'm like, really? Am I starting to change my, what does that mean, changing my reality? And I realized I was not happy with my reality. But the problem is that what the face that we have on the outside is different from our experience on the inside. We all walk around with people who might be smiling, who might be good on the outside. They look like they have a good status, they have a good job. That's why I call it functional alcoholic, because on the outside nobody can tell. The only people who can tell is either them or maybe the people closest to them. And it happens a lot with my clients when there's a husband or a wife, they're all really alcoholic. Nobody else knows about it. They're the only ones, in the pain that they go through in that household is another story. But it's not just alcohol, and I realized over the years, as I kind of went through my research, we're addicted to all kinds of stuff. We can be addicted to work, we can be addicted to shopping, we can be addicted to social media, but we won't call it that. But we'll call it, oh, I just have a habit, or I'm just having fun, or I'm just trying to relax. And I'm not nothing against those mediums, but if a medium becomes as a source to escape the pain within or the reality that you need to face, and it happens consistently and you cannot control it, that's addiction. You can name it all kinds of things, but that's addiction, which means it's up to you. Like, in this, why I like this phrase, the truth will set you free. Well, what is your truth? Only you can face it. And what ends up happening, and the reason why it's hard to leave any kind of addiction, is because you will have to face the discomfort of, first of all, you have to face the truth of whatever you're not facing, and then go through the pain of working through that. That's why most people. And then we live in a world where all kinds of addictions are promoted. And it's like Dr. Gabor Mate said that there are certain addictions we look down upon, but there are certain addictions we look up to. For example, there are business owners who are addicted to work, but we celebrate that. We celebrate that every day, but that comes at a cost of their whole family. That comes at a cost of their relationships. That comes at a cost of their own health and well-being. But we celebrate that because that outer success has value in society, even if it comes at a cost. There are people who are addicted to shopping, but we don't. We kind of look at that, but we'll laugh at that. But that could be a real problem. There are people who are addicted to games. There are people who are addicted to all kinds of stuff. Now, society is arbitrary in its definitions, but you're the only one who know in your experience that you might be running away from something. And the simple sign is that you have no control over it. If you pick up your phone every 5 minutes, start going there, and then you pick it up again. I joke around with one of my friends who went on a trip with us. He would pick up his phone every few minutes. I'm like, what's going on with your phone? He's like, are you not having fun here? It's like, yeah, no, I'm good. I'm just checking something. And it happened like throughout the day. I'm like, no, you're not checking anything. That's just that looks like a problem to me.
No, I think it's worth unpacking because they say you get to know people when you travel with them. So I guess Faisal, another thing that you mentioned, circling back, that was interesting was the idea that you started working on the weekends so that you couldn't party. And it kind of lends itself to the idea of like lifestyle design, kind of identifying a problem or a behavior that you want to change, and building a lifestyle so that you're more likely to change it. So I guess what I want to understand, Faisal, is how did you identify, other than the vomiting and the blood, how did you identify that alcohol was a problem, and how did you maybe position it so that you're able to come out of this addiction? Because I think you also mentioned how not many people are fortunate, lucky enough to be able to.
Yeah. So it was such a, the hardest part of not drinking was not, it was hard enough for me to stop. So I went cold turkey for about 4 years, and like I stopped. And then I had a social gathering where like some of my friends, family, they were drinking. And the hardest part was not drinking in front of them. And a lot of times people fall to social influence more than anything else. And I realized that, oh, you know what? It wasn't hard for me to stop because I realized the reasons behind it. But they don't understand why I'm drinking, and they're taking it personally because now it's challenging their identity around drinking. And that was such a big lesson, because every time after a little while, and it's like, oh, how come you're not drinking? You should be drinking. Maybe you can just have one drink. Maybe, like, oh, that's interesting. And they're very uncomfortable towards that. And this also speaks to the, like, how we get influenced by our environment. And it doesn't matter how much control you have internally, you will get influenced to some degree. But for me, at least, the realization journey was not a one time thing. It happened over the course of years. In the beginning, it was more like, you know what, I see the problem, but I don't actually know what is causing it. So alcohol was actually working. And the reason why I say it was working, because it was alleviating the pain. The problem is that it has negative side effects. This is part of the reason why a lot of religions have a problem with it. But the negative side effects were, in the moment, it will alleviate the pain and you could live a different identity. But then the next day, it has an effect on your whole system, on your whole, and over time, it accumulates. Or in your system, and it also accumulates in all kinds of behaviors. So I started noticing patterns of, once I admitted it, then I started noticing patterns of how I would treat other people when I would be under the influence. I started noticing how people would react to me, and then I was like, oh, this has way too big of an effect than I think. And then over time, I had to make a decision. You know what, let me move away. And one of the biggest things that helped sustain it, I had to find better environments for me to sustain that long term, until I could have the reasoning. And I'd say the biggest change in that was, once I dealt with the trauma within, the pain within, it was not a hard decision to stop it. Even if I had the cravings, it was as simple as that. You know what? The reason why I was dealing with this is because I had to deal with this pain. Now that I have dealt with this pain, I don't actually need to drink. And I remember years ago, I went to this all-inclusive resort, and I go there, and everybody was drinking, and it was a company event and everything. Like, I didn't feel the need to drink, and I was just fine. And after that, I realized, oh, you know what, that's not a problem anymore. And it was just a natural effect of the healing process, I would say. But it took
Fa-
years, I'll say that.
Faisal, you said something interesting in this answer. It sounded like you said that dealing with the trauma within helped you overcome the addiction to alcohol. Do you feel like that's what addiction is, like escaping your reality fundamentally?
It is. I would say it's disconnection from something. It's either disconnection from your faith, your relationship, or your own self. There's some kind of and we're understanding more and more in the research that addiction is literally the opposite of connection. When you lose connection with, if you lose connection with faith, it creates a problem internally. You lose connection with your relationships, it creates a problem internally. You lose connection with your purpose, it creates a problem internally. And over time, you stack on all these, and you can have a very functioning individual. It doesn't have to be alcohol. It could be, that person could be super addicted to their career path, and nobody would say anything, and they wouldn't even admit it to themselves, but they will leave a trail behind of all kinds of problems, until one day the life hits them, whether their health goes down, or they see the impact on their relationships with their kids, family, whoever. And that's when regret sets in, and that's when they see that, you know what, this had a huge impact on me. And that's where they might change, or they might not, who knows. But the lasting impact of any addiction, like, it leaves a trail of all kinds of hurts and challenges in your life, whether it's internal or external. But I would say it's the complete opposite of connection. And connection for human beings is probably one of the highest natural value system. Is that if we don't feel connected to our social group, our faith, our culture, our identity, our path, our purpose, something is going wrong internally, even if it doesn't appear so on the outside.
Faisal, you're definitely giving us a lot to think about. And what I want to say is, if you're listening to this conversation and if it's causing you to pause and think, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the like button. Share this episode with somebody else who's looking to grow and maybe, unbeknownst to you, has their own addiction that they're working through, whether that's addiction to work, money, religion, alcohol, drugs, whatever it might be. If it's a bit of a disconnect, like Faisal mentioned, then this episode might be what they need to be able to reconnect and maybe scale more aggressively. Now, Faisal, you did define addiction as a bit of a disconnect, which I think is a quite interesting definition. You also mentioned how you appeared to be doing very well. You were a functioning alcoholic, as you said. You also work with a lot of people and have helped a lot of people. How often is it that people have a disconnect, whether it's alcohol or maybe challenges in their marriage or maybe something else, and everything kind of seems fine to the outsider?
Yeah, I'd say much more often than people think. So most people who actually start working with me, they work with me at some kind of business capacity, which means that they're struggling to move their business forward. And almost, I'd say 8 out of 10 times, it's a disconnection within their life. It's a relationship challenge, or it's a purpose challenge. It's either a personal or a relationship. Those are two big ones, or it could be a spiritual disconnection too that comes up, and they're not aware. Sometimes they're aware of it, sometimes they're not, but they think that the dominant problem is business, or they think that the dominant, because those are the things that we get rewarded for, is the outer status, the outer things that people can see, but we don't get rewarded for being happy internally. Well, I'd rather you be successful than be happy, but could you be successful and happy at the same time? I really think you can, but you will. And there was a statement said by a psychologist who said that if enlightenment or growth or these kind of things were easy, everybody would do it. It's actually a very painful process, and a lot of times when they come to me, we start with a business, but almost always it ends up in their relationships or a disconnection. Even when I work with the corporate clients, when I work with executives, you start to see I get hired to help them become a better leader, and they need to build a better system, better team. Almost always goes to their personal life. And the same disconnection they have their personal life, it shows up a lot of times in their work. Same thing with business owners who've been at it for 10, 20, 30 years. They will be like, there's something off. They've plateaued in their business. Something has happened. The thing they were running away from all their life comes back around. It just comes back around in a different form.
I love that, Faisal, because this might surprise you, it might not. This isn't the first time that I've heard this on the podcast. The idea that the challenges in your personal life, known to you or unbeknownst to you, do impact your efficiency and your ability to scale at work. But I don't really hear that in life. When you're talking to high performing people, there isn't the idea that you need to slow down, take stock of maybe the areas in your life that you're not focused on. Maybe it's like you need to rebalance religiously, you need to rebalance your family, work life balance. And that balance doesn't need to be 50-50. It can be whatever, but it just needs to kind of be rebalanced. It feels like this conversation isn't really being had on social media or in schools or in business lectures. I don't know. I don't have an MBA, so I don't know. I want to kind of unpack your perspective, Faisal, because you do work with a lot of executives, and it sounds like 8 out of 10 of them are coming to you without really knowing that this is the root challenge or problem. Anecdotally, when you look at it, why is this such a big gap or such an unmet need?
It goes back to what we talked about on my podcast, that, and this is a common pattern that I've seen, that we've been trained in all kinds of things since childhood, but unfortunately, and I'll talk about where the break happened, but unfortunately the three areas that we need the most is knowing yourself, knowing how to be in relationships, and knowing how to deal with finances in the world, how business works, financing, how value works. None of those were actually trained in, unless you specifically go towards a thing, or you're born in an entrepreneurial family. Or even if you're born in an entrepreneurial family, knowing yourself is not the biggest factor in there. It's like, how are you going to move the business? So one of those areas is a disconnect for us. And I would say, if you look at the history of it, as soon as we went from like a community to a nuclear family, especially in the Western world, and as soon as you bring in the industrial boom and the people are growing really fast, and it was this psychologist who studied and I think in 1900s, when US was kind of booming, GDP, everything was going up, employment rates were high. He was seeing that the happiness factors and satisfaction, fulfillment were going the inverse of that. And he didn't understand why all that abundance was bringing more misery to people. And he had to figure out, that was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. which came out of that. And when you realize that we have certain needs as human beings, and in the beginning those needs are very basic survival needs, but as we kind of grow through no needs, the need for connection, the need for respect, the need for status, the need for growth, and at the time there's the need for enlightenment, and at different stages in your life you're going to go towards different things, and not everybody will go through the whole hierarchy of needs either. But ultimately, we're not trained well in this area. We're trained to compartmentalize our knowledge. We're trained to look at one thing and not look at other. We're not trained to look at our life holistically. We're trained to look at it in segments. I look at it like the Manhattan Project. The reason it was so successful because they separated all the scientists and got them to work in separate areas, and then brought together the research and built that crazy thing that cost a lot of lives. But that was a very smart thing, but it kept knowledge compartmentalized. I think we're all trained that way. We keep, man, I can't tell you how many times I will be on a call with a project manager who deals with multiple multinational big projects, but when you look at their personal life, it's a mess. Once they connect the dot between the their external skill sets at work and their internal, all of a sudden they're like, I have the skill set already, why am I not doing this? I don't know where the disconnects happen, but over time we build these compartmentalized areas of knowledge, and it just doesn't show up. And a lot of my work has been, how can we connect your skill sets, knowledge, and wisdom, and how can you build a life that's worth living for you? And I don't even look at it about balance, because everybody will define their idea of balance differently. But I look at it, how can you live a life that's going to be worth it for you? Because ultimately, at the end of it, you're going to ask yourself, you're going to come into this life as yourself, leave as yourself. And you're not going to take anything with you. You didn't come here with anything. You're going to just go away with yourself. If you, I believe we come as a soul, we leave as a soul. But what you're going to leave behind, whether those are values, ways of sharing things with other people, is probably going to be the most important things. And just like you, I believe we come here to make life a little bit better, for even if it was for a couple of people around us. And I like this quote from a spiritual teacher that said, the least you could do is be happy. It's a simple statement, but it's a very hard thing to do, because that will actually affect those around you. But at least at the end of my life, I don't want to have any regrets around who I am and what I was dedicated to. And when I meet my creator, I want to be like, you know what? I did everything, or at least most things you built me to do, and I left my world behind a little bit better than I came into. And it doesn't matter how big that is, because when I started this path, I'm like, if I can help one person, I'm happy with that.
Faisal, I love the mentality. And thank you so much for taking the time to share your mentality with us and help us unpack it. One question I did want to ask Faisal, just to help understand your outlook on your life, has been obviously you went through a lot of challenges. You touched on maybe the idea of questioning what the value of living is. It sounds like a very simple statement, but there's a lot of depth there, and kind of quote unquote bouncing back from that type of mentality to maybe where you are today is not easy at all. But at the same time, you mentioned that, your experiences helped form you as the person you are today. When you look at maybe your children, how do you take all of that knowledge and package it in a way that can kind of help upskill them while recognizing that they're not learning this at school? You mentioned a couple of different, knowledge gaps, areas that people should learn about but don't. One of them was like individual like clarity, knowing yourself. Another of them was like, financial clarity. So, ultimately, Faisal, the question here is like, what are you doing to enable your children to succeed? And what portion of that is enabling them to really go through the valley of despair or traverse a canyon of challenges? Like, help us understand, your mindset, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I love that, and that's such a. And a lot of my clients are in the investing world. There's a big conversation around generational wealth and all kinds of stuff. I don't believe in generational wealth, and like, what the hell are you passing it on? In fact, if you actually go to a golden age of every culture, if you take the Western culture and the golden age of Greece, one of the worst things to pass on was money because they knew it would almost always lead to some kind of corruption if it didn't come with training and value system. We also know that if you study some of the wealthiest families, very few of them have been able to hold wealth. And the ones who have been able to hold wealth, they actually passed on training and value system and a whole system that they go through, an initiation for them to be able to keep it. And it's not like they're just flaunting the money, but most people, when they say they want to pass on generational wealth, I don't know what they're talking about. And that's the idea. They come in because it's a popular idea promoted by some influencer that, oh, you can pass on things. So at least in my experience, when I look back, Health was not the biggest problem for me. I mean, at least if you look at it from a subjective point of view, I came from a place where everybody was poor. When we came here, it was like, this was like, we lived in a ghetto area in Toronto, and I thought I was rich. And I didn't understand when my friend kept saying, like, we got to get out of here. It took me a couple of years to catch on. He's like, oh, that's what you're talking about that. But relative to where we came from, I was rich, but then that didn't really make me any happier. In fact, I became more miserable. Why is that? So wealth was one factor, and I'm not saying it's not important. I don't think it's anything to celebrate if you're poor, because it comes with its own challenges. But at least the way I look at it as a parent is, my biggest challenge was, I didn't know who I was outside, and I didn't know what my path was. Outside of what I learned from my parents, from my culture, from my religion at the surface, I didn't know how to make sense of who I was in that whole mix and my path. And if you actually go deeper into this stuff, you realize that, for example, let's take something as simple that we take for granted: your thoughts. Your thoughts are passed on to you by your family in a specific language that's given to them by a culture. And those thoughts make up a huge part of who you are in your identity, your name, whether you're Muslim, Christian, whatever, whether you are part of this culture. And those identities shape how you behave out in the world. But that's not who you are. If you actually, if it's somebody who comes from the spiritual world, or you have faith, you understand that you didn't come here with a name, you didn't come here with a language, you came here as a soul. Yes, those things are important, but who are you underneath of all of that? That was my biggest struggle, and my whole effort, at least both for my wife and I, is I want them to know themselves beyond those identities that we give them. And that's the biggest gift I think I can give them. So it means that they need to be confident in who they are, not what they're told by other people, and which is the influence we all fall prey to. And we've done some radical things towards that, and we've well, for the good or the bad. And my hope is that it has a net positive effect on them. As I've shared with you, we travel around, we spend a lot of time with them. My wife homeschools them. And we want them to be educated in their own thought process, to manage their own emotions, know what God, universe, creation, everything is, based on their conclusions, not because I'm telling them that or somebody else is telling them that. And then I also want them to understand how they can create value in the marketplace. I'd rather give them the model to create value than give them a bunch of money, because that's not going to help them. And finally, I want them to understand how relationships work, because the more I've been in business, the more I've realized that relationships, your network makes up everything pretty much. And if you don't know how to build relationships, especially long-term relationships, and which is one of the biggest problems a lot of high achievers that I work with, when they transition towards business, even though they say that, oh, I'm a good team player, they don't know how to create relationships and build partnerships. They struggle with that heavily, from the due diligence process all the way to working well with their team, all the way to working towards building a successful business. It is a hard process for everybody, including me. I had to learn that process. That requires influence, that requires skill sets around sales, communication, so many things that were not really explicitly taught. So I'd rather them learn all that stuff along with some of the core subjects like math and English and other things they might need to know. And I want them to learn this experientially. That's part of the reason why we travel everywhere. We meet all kinds of people. We push them to be in uncomfortable situations, make friends wherever they go, and hopefully learn from their experience. I know we're not going to be close to perfect, and I always joke around with I was sharing this with a friend the other day, like, one day my kids are gonna come, is like, Dad, this is what you did wrong here. And I'll look at them, I'll be like, I apologize for that, I'll give them the support that they need, I'll admit that, but I'll be like, it's your responsibility now, you gotta carry forward. My job was to give you the net positive effect. And also I want to share that, like, with all the challenges that I went through, my parents did their best. They were in a very difficult circumstance, and having to escape their country, everything they knew, with the clothes on their back and no family, nobody around. I don't know if I'd be able to do any better than that. But they gave us at least a foundation from those experiences to build on. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I think what has helped me move in a direction that's unique, that's different, that has given me the experience that I want in my family, is because I've figured out, like, my path is about this. Like, this is what I stand for, and this is what I'm here for. This is my purpose, and I'll pass on whatever I can to my kids, and I'll equip them with the knowledge, skill sets that they need to kind of build the life that they want. And hopefully, in that process, we can all work together and build a better community as we move forward.
Thank you for that, Faisal. It's very interesting to reflect on. And I guess the follow-up question would be is this how you approach business as well? Obviously, you're a coach, you help upskill people, you help people identify gaps. Does this mentality that you live in your personal life also reflect in your business? The idea of like, do the best you can, and then ultimately it's kind of on, in this situation you mentioned on your kids to kind of see how they actually implement that information. But maybe as an entrepreneur, as a business person, it's on the market to see how it appreciates your product or doesn't.
Well, I mean, my values don't change in business just because I'm in business. I'm the same person in business as I am in my personal life. The difference is how I, of course, approach it. The strategy is a little bit different. But in business, I believe in long term relationships because that's what makes up all of business. My favorite thing in business is collaborations. Have collaborated with my clients. I have business partners. I've collaborated with all kinds of people in business over the past decade. And my favorite thing is to start with an idea and build something tangible. That's like the most fun thing, and it's the most difficult thing to do, especially with somebody who has a very different thinking process, because you have to learn empathy, you have to understand other people's perspective, you have to be open to feedback, you have to be curious, you have to be to battle the differences in thinking and strategy, and constantly fight for your ideas and let go of things. Like, it is hard to work together. That's why it's not an easy thing to build a business and an organization. It's not an easy thing to build a community. So I the way I look at it is that for me, business, whether it's with my clients, with my business partners, with other collaborators, it's a long-term relationship. In fact, one of the ways that if I talk to somebody within 20 minutes, if in that conversation I cannot answer this question, would I be open to working with this person for the next 10 years? If I cannot answer that with a yes, then I don't care if it's a client or collaborator. My answer is no, because then for me, like I've learned, relationships are hard to build. You're putting a lot of time and energy. No short-term gain is worth it to me. And plus, I'm not just in business to do business. I look at it as a part of my purpose. I want to impact people in a positive way. So who are the kind of people do I want to be around? And like I said, my clients go through the same rigorous process. I joke around with my clients. You have to go through 2-3 hours of conversation with me before you ever become a client. So I have to put you through that. But that's because I want to know, are we aligned? Would I be able to support them long term? And usually I get started with a client who's in business. I end up working with their whole family and business partners in a few years. And many of my clients have stayed with me 2+5-6 years with me. Why? Because I approach my relationships the same exact ways. Like, I'll serve you in my personal life or serve you in my business. I'm not perfect in any of these areas, but I strive to be better every day.
So Faisal, that brings me to, I guess, my next question, which would be maybe your mentality, more of a relationship building mentality with what seems to be prevalent in the marketplace, the idea of instant gratification, the idea of likes, the idea of, sharing, quick reels, etc. For you, when you look at the marketplace, do you feel like your strategy and your approach works for you, but is at odds with maybe what's on trend, or maybe how the younger generation, your kids, my kids, look at and process information, and maybe become more transactional versus more long-term oriented and really investing in relationships? Because like you mentioned, your sales cycle, so to speak, quote unquote, is like 3 hours versus maybe a high ticket salesman who would have like a one call close.
Yeah. So I also look at that. I mean, numbers a lot of times speak more than, like, part of it is your value system and actually knowing what kind of business you're building, how much. When somebody comes to me, a lot of times, I want to make $10 million a year. My first question is why? It's like, why is that important to you? And I need them to be able to communicate why that's important. And a lot of times what I get is, well, it will give me the lifestyle, and then I go towards I actually get them to calculate what the lifestyle they're looking for. And usually when they calculate it, it's not more than $200,000-300,000 a year. I'm like, so what is a 9,900,000 whatever thousand for? They're like, well, it's a good buffer to have. I'm like, I'm nothing against it. I'm like, that's a pretty big buffer for a lifestyle. But so what are you getting? What are you using that for? And that's what actually pushes people to work unnecessarily towards some end that is vague in their mind. But I know what kind of business I want. I've never gone towards creating shortcuts in business, because I've looked at it as like, what are the things that are important to me? My faith is important. Who I am is important. My family is important to me. My business path is important to me. And my purposes, and they're all important pieces of my life. I can't leave one for the other. So it forces me to look at it in perspective. That doesn't mean That doesn't mean I'm not ambitious, but it's actually much complicated, more complicated to work all those out. So my sales cycle is based on my values, and also the numbers speak for it. So here's what happened. I'll tell you, I purposely went slower in the first 3 years of my business, and I had all kinds of peers around me. But 3 years, fast forward 3, 4 years later, I was way ahead in terms of the value that I was delivering in the marketplace. And one of the reasons why I get to train other coaches, and I work with many of them, many of these guys started just the same time as me or even before me, but I accumulated in the past decade over 20, 30 years of experience because I led with value. I dedicated myself. I did the work consistently, and I didn't leave my values behind at the cost of like my values at the cost of my values for an opportunity. So again, it depends on your values. And again, if this works, don't leave your value just because somebody else has a different sales process or marketing process. And when it comes to, I would say, social media, the new generation, all that stuff, I don't believe people are just the way they are just because of the new generation. Yeah, every generation changes happen, but all you have to do is look at every family's behavior. If you leave your kids in front of TikTok or YouTube Shorts, and you leave them in kindergarten all day, and they are exposed to you 1 hour a week or 5 hours a week, well, there's a reason why they think like the public, and that's a hard decision. My wife didn't want to leave her career behind. Like, she's a coach just like me. She's very good at it. She claims that she's a better coach than I am, but time will tell. But and she works with some of my clients as well. But we've chosen to spend time with our kids. That means that she gets to do a lot of her schooling and their schooling. She gets to spend time with them. We both spend time with them. So I have to pull myself out from business and actually do that. And it's not easy. Now I tell people I run two businesses, and it's equivalent to I work in 37, 36 hours equivalent to somebody working 80 hours because I force myself to focus in those time. I leverage the systems and people around me to do the work. But that doesn't mean I do any less work than you. It's just that I've learned to put significance in the areas that matter. So we take active part in our kids' education and their lifestyle. We are their biggest influence, and of course we have other people around us too, so they're not just raised other people who are aligned with us. They have uncles, aunts, friends, other friends who influence them in positive ways, but we've tried to build a community of people around them that they can reach out to. Will they be different? Parts of them will be the same as the other generation, but I can almost assume that they will be trained to look for long-term opportunity. They'll be trained to look for value to add other people's lives. They'll be trained to be on a growth path. They'll be trained to look for what matters to them in their value system versus what matters to others, even if it's a difficult decision. Like, all that stuff will be part of their training. And if I'm not doing that stuff, then I can't claim 20 years later that, oh, I did my part. And that is, again, all this stuff is hard work, and it can also, for me, it's fun and hard work, but it requires us to shift the way we run our life. Is that they are a big part of our focus, and our values are a big part of our focus that we want to pass on. And they can live within the same culture and be a little bit different from the culture. By the way, there's a whole idea, if you didn't know this, as of a parallel culture. In every major culture, there are people who run a parallel culture within the major culture. And what ends up happening, if you look at it over the course of 50 plus years or whatever, however long, that parallel culture, once the bigger culture goes towards corruption, the parallel culture rises up. So it means that for centuries, humans have had parallel cultures, which means families, communities have lived within the same culture thinking differently. And they waited for the time when there's a need for their culture to come in. And usually societies go through these cycles of corruption. When they hit the lowest point, then what happens? The parallel culture that comes in and say, you know what, I can lead the way. And at least long term, my hope is that whoever that is around us, our kids, they grow with us and they become a force to contribute in whatever community we're part of.
I really loved the conversation, Faisal. The mentality you've shared, how you're uplifting clients, how you're uplifting, your kids. If somebody is listening to this conversation, they're curious to learn more about you, more about the products and services you offer. What's the best way for them to connect with you?
So if you just search my name, Faisal Ensaun, you can find everything about me, but faisalensaun.com might be the best place. I usually, like I said, I lead with value. So I usually do regular workshops where you will have an opportunity to be in conversation with me. I do this as a way to support anybody who wants to be supported, whether it's in the area of building your vision, being more productive, making decisions during uncertainty, or creating the freedom that matters to you. I'll do these workshops and you'll have a chance to be with me on a 2 hour call, and I'll support you. And there are lots of other value adds. As soon as you sign up to my newsletter, you'll get lots of value and bonuses. And I have my regular podcast that you can gain a lot from. But all that stuff will be in FaisalEnsaun.com.
Beautiful. So what we'll do is we'll include those links in the description below. Faisal, this has been a really valuable conversation because it reminds us that building isn't just about strategy or opportunity. It's about internal alignment. You touched on it when you mentioned, the struggle with alcohol. You touched on it throughout when you talked about the clarity with which you try to help clients with and you try to implement in your life and your kids' lives as well. And just how it helps, and how that clarity helps impact and reflect our ability to execute in our businesses. For anyone listening to this episode, we will include the links down below. That way you can reach out directly to Faisal. You can check out his website, you can check out the newsletter, you can check out his workshops, and then ultimately it can help you grow 1%. If you did find something valuable from this episode, please do consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a review. Tell us what you loved most, what resonated, and share it with somebody else who can find value as well. We'll see you guys in the next episode of MyFinJourney. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you.